Let's see. Oh. Oh. Everybody's so quiet.
I think the meeting hasn't started yet.
Oh, I see.
It's good to hear from you though, Bob.
All right. Oh. Morning, Father.
Baby, come here. Come here. Come here. What's that?
All right. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Just do this if you can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Great. Well, I am so glad that you are all here, that we're able to meet. Thank you. We'll have people, I'm sure.
Hello.
Hello?
Father, we lost you there.
Yeah, I can't hear you any longer, Sammy. Are you there, Sammy?
Sammy?
I think he dropped.
He's out of it. He's not, his picture's disappeared.
Yeah, we'll give him a few minutes.
He froze and went away. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Agree.
Can Renee take over?
Maybe so.
Oh,
And or the senior warden or another member of,
Renee's unmuted. Hold on.
oh, no. Sammy will be back in just a minute. He's just looking for good Wi-Fi. He's down at the church.
Oh.
and I know Morgan and Heather will be here.
They're already here.
They're there. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, there you go.
I apologize. That doesn't bode well for the rest of the way this is going. Although that has been my experience with Zoom and with everything else, is that I tend to jack it up. So, but let's hope that it's not going to work. I'm trying to mute everybody. I don't know if I can do that. Let's see. Everybody
I believe you
should
can do
be.
it one by one. I think you can do it one by one if necessary.
All right,
But if
everybody should be muted if you're not.
Yeah, if you go into participants, you can mute everybody.
All right, here I go. I'm muting people. All right, and I'm going to unmute people. You should be logging on mute. So let me, I don't know what happened there, but I'm going to say a prayer. But I was just welcoming folks and saying how glad that I am that you're here. Thank you so much for being part of this call. And let me get to my notes. All right. So we'll go ahead and start. And I'm going to pray a collect that I found from the 1929 Scottish Book of Common Prayer. It's a time for to prayer for a time of sickness. And so the Lord be with you. O Almighty and merciful God, with whom are the issues of life and death, grant us, we beseech thee, help and deliverance in this time of sickness and mortality, and sanctify to us this affliction, that in our sore distress we may turn our hearts unto thee. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, welcome again. Let me do just a little, do my best to do a little Zoom intro. I'm aware that maybe not everybody has taken part in meetings like this, at least not this size, where we hope to have some back and forth. Just to explain what's going on right now. When you joined, you should have joined muted, because there's so many people that are participating in this meeting. And so you can unmute yourself if at any time you want to. If you're using a laptop, there's a button at the bottom left corner that you can click to unmute yourself. If you're on a tablet, I think it's often at the top, but on a computer, it's down at the bottom. And it's the same with video. There's a button there that says you can stop your video, and then you can start it back up. You can turn the video off. Sometimes something happens in the background. There's some kind of movement, or you may want to turn it off so as not to distract, or perhaps you want to yell at the screen and just block that out so none of us see that. If you want to speak, if you have a question once we get farther into the meeting, after you speak, go ahead and mute your mic back, because so that there's no feedback and there's no background noise, and everyone can hear when the panelists are answering the question. You can also type your question if you wish. I've got a list of some that people have already submitted, but you can type your question in the chat box. So if you're using a laptop and you go down and you see there's a button that says participants. If you click that button, you'll see over a little flyout box comes over on the right that tells you who is in the meeting. And if you click the chat button, then a little window will come up also over on the right that has the chat in it. There is also, add one more thing. You may want to put it on speaker view instead of the gallery view. If you put it on speaker view, then whoever is speaking at that moment kind of grows to fill your screen, and that way you can see. You can better see the person speaking and understand what they're saying. And finally, if you want to ask a question and you would like to, one way you can do that is to raise your hand. And I can't see everyone at the same time. So if you're raising your hand and you're on mute, I can't see you. But over in the chat box below the participants, there should be a little hand. You can click that, and then you will pop up in my screen over to the right. And then I will call on you, unmute you, and you can be able to talk to anybody that you want. Okay? All right.
Sammy, to get
yeah.
that, you have to click participants in order to get the raise hand button.
Correct. So if you have to click participants for the hand and the chat in order to be able to type a question in. I will tell you one other thing that I learned only too late, which is this is our canon to the ordinary said this the other day. It's always a good idea to expect that anyone can see anything that you type at any time in any meeting online. So there's a way that you can text each other directly without texting the entire group. Turns out that the Zoom host gets a copy of all of those texts at the end. So I only found that out after my clergy colleagues and I had been texting each other during the bishop's meetings every week. So just so you know, don't type anything that you don't want anybody else to see. Awesome. So I want to announce the panelists, then I'm going to frame our conversation, then we'll open for questions. So I am pleased to today, hopefully they are all here. I have not checked, but I'm assuming they're here. I'm pleased to be joined first of all by your wardens. Gretchen Abernathy is your senior warden, and Brian Rourke is your junior warden. You may know that the wardens are voted on by the vestry, and they are my closest counselors, as well as the people that are involved in things temporal. So that means that thinking about buildings, about cleaning, about access, things like that. The vestry has a large say in that, and I wanted them to be here. So they've graciously agreed that they would be part of this conversation. The past several weeks, I've asked individually, had a lot of individual conversations, and then one larger conversation with a group of medical personnel. We're really blessed in our church to have some incredibly bright and accomplished people in our parish. And so the panel, the people that I've asked to be a part today, first of all, Doug Heimberger, and I'm going to introduce them in case you may already know them, or perhaps you're newer and you don't know who they are. So Doug Heimberger is professor of medicine and global health at Vanderbilt Medical Center. His particular area of expertise and research is global public health, including infectious diseases and chronic diseases. So it makes him a really important voice, I think, for this. Andy Michael. Andy is assistant professor of psychiatry at Vanderbilt, but he also cares for veterans at the VA hospital in Nashville and is a former senior warden here at St. Bartholomew's and a fine angler. Andrew Smithen has a BS in medical technology and MS in medical science. And for the past 5 years, Andrew has managed the care and satellite laboratories at Vanderbilt. So he's been working an incredible amount managing this laboratory. I know he's tired. He's also part of he's on the vestry. Heather Wills. Heather is a registered nurse, and she previously served as a parish nurse here for our congregation at St. Bees. Currently, Heather is serving the dying and their families at the inpatient residence of Alive Hospice here in Nashville. And then Heather's husband, Morgan Wills, is an internal medicine physician. He serves as president and CEO of Salome Health, which is a nonprofit that provides Christ-centered, compassionate health care to the underserved, not undeserved, we're all deserved, but to the underserved. And then there's me. I have a BA, a JD, and MDiv, none of which will do any of us any good right now. So I'm really grateful for all those people being on the call, and I look forward to you hearing directly from each one of them. So let me frame our conversation for a second. Hopefully you were able to see there's a video that accompanied an email that went out last week, which was actually the second of 2 emails beginning to lay out this vision of what it might look for us to return to, in a deliberate process, to return to public in-person worship here at St. Bartholomew's. It also had connection to some other documents, to the bishop's Wilderness Road as a document that he's prepared to help the clergy and all the people in the diocese frame and understand where we are right now. And then there's also a group of that email linked you to some particular protocols that we've developed for St. Bartholomew's. So there's no I know I don't have time to go into the entire protocol document. So I ask you to please read that carefully. If you haven't already had a chance to do so, maybe in the coming days, if you can take some time. But where we are, as I understand it, is that we are in Nashville. We're still in phase 1 of the mayor's roadmap. There's also a link to that in our documents as well, the mayor's roadmap for reopening. And that has some limitations on how big groups can be, what kind of social distancing you need to have, capacity for certain rooms and things like that. Phase 2, I believe will begin tomorrow, Monday the 25th, which bumps us up to a higher capacity and a larger floor number for the number of people that can be in a group that gathers. And my intention as your rector is tentatively for us to reopen public in-person worship on the Lord's Day, on a Sunday, on June the 7th. We will not do it before then. That's the plan. I've got it penciled in to do it on June the 7th. And that would be at 8 o'clock in the morning in the gym, because we are still going to be live streaming worship for the foreseeable future, because there are people that are not going to be comfortable coming out. There are people that are already at risk that are either because of age or because of medical conditions. They are not able to come out, and we will not allow them to be cut off. We want to still have streaming worship. But to allow as many people as possible if you're comfortable, to begin to come back and to make your communion, because that's so central to who we are as Episcopalians. Father Charlie and I, we will say the Mass every weekday as well at 12:15. That's going to be in the nave. So if you would like to be part of those, there's a link in what we sent out last week. And there's a link on the website as well, where you can go onto a sign up Genius that Gayleen Latham is running for us, that where right now there will be a limit of 9 communicants plus the celebrant. We can only have a group of 10. Even though tomorrow we're going to phase 2 as a city, I'm going to proceed more cautiously, I think, for our parish. So if you want to be one of those 10, sign up to come to that, because we need to make sure that we know who's going to be there so that we don't exceed the number that we can have. The protocols themselves, just very briefly, the outline of them is that before worship ever takes place in our public spaces, we have had a cleaning done. And Sally's worked really hard on signage, Sally and Matt, signage all around the parish. We've moved the books from the worship area in the nave, so that there are fewer hard surfaces to touch. And in phase 1 of this reopening, or the first phase of our reopening, we will limit ourselves to 10 people. As I said, live stream will continue Sundays at 9:30. Any hard surfaces that have been touched will be cleaned between our worship, between one worship service and the next. We must wear masks. And I'm sure there'll be questions about that for the doctors today and the nurses and the people that are on the panel. But we've been directed to, and I think masks and social distancing, which means one person per every 6 feet, or one family group is the number that we're trying to keep to. And then as much as it is hard to do, as I can't be your priest and your rector without discouraging as strongly as I can people who are at risk not to come at this time, to continue to worship from home. We will bring you the Eucharist, so we'll make a Eucharistic visit to your home if we can. But if you're over 65, children that are under 2, or parents with children under 2 because they can't wear masks for an hour or 45 minutes, we'll probably shorten the service some, by the way. And other churches are doing different things. So some churches are saying even children anywhere under 10 I think St. George's says under 10, they recommend that you not come. But if you are at risk, I just can't emphasize strongly enough how much I love you and do not want you to become ill. And so I'm trying to discourage you from coming. Because the books won't be in there and we won't have bulletins for regular weekday masses, I've instituted a BYOBCP policy, which means bring your own prayer book. If you don't have one, you can buy one online. There's a link to that in the email the other day. And there you can also download things on apps and websites to do that. So we'll also limit the number of chances that we have to come into contact with each other. We're using one particular door so that you can come in. No passing of the peace, no passing offering plates, none of that. For now, communion in one kind will continue to be the norm. That means the bread only. We've already gotten one question about that, which I'll respond to later. But for right now, the communion, simply the Blessed Sacrament of the consecrated bread. And as you all know now, being good Anglicans, the doctrine of concomitance says that if you receive one kind, that's as good as receiving in both kinds. So that's sufficient. Also in that document, the protocols for receiving Holy Communion are detailed, and I won't go into those here because they're a little bit longer and you can find them. I would recommend that you review them right before you come to communion. There's still no definitive answer on music. I don't know if David is on this call, and if he is, later on, if there's a question about music at all and he wanted to jump onto the panel, I should have asked him to be here anyway, and I didn't think about it. But we don't have a definitive answer about what sort of singing and what kind of congregational singing or music is appropriate. And but we're trying to figure that out because that is such a central, closely held value here of the parish. And then finally, in those documents, I've said there's some things for each of us to do, for all of us to do. We're going to have masks here. So if you forget to bring one from home, there are already people, Kathy Edwards and others have already dropped masks off. They've donated those. We're trying to upgrade our technology. And so we created an audio-visual fund that we are using that money to buy some more equipment so that our live stream is better. We can serve the people that will be at home for the foreseeable future better. And then finally, just take care of yourself. Self-care is incredibly important. I've been thinking about this in terms of there's a new social contract that I think that we have in place that we are all getting used to, which says that we should use all caution to take care of ourselves so that we don't get the people that we love or even the people that we don't even know, so that we don't run the risk of them of becoming sick because of something that we've done. So it's just a chance for prayerful consideration of what it means now to love neighbor, to love God. One last point. None of us should assume that we have the definitive answer about how this should be done. The bishop's document that he sent and the guidance he's given to clergy is not a directive to start worshiping. It is simply his permission for us to begin to explore ways to start to come back together. And I see this as absolutely as an opportunity for us to be formed in different ways, an opportunity for us, for all of us, me chief among everybody, to practice and demonstrate and model self-sacrificial love, the love that places the good of the other over the good that is to myself. And so for me, my operating assumptions and the ones that I'm asking of staff, and I'd ask you, is for patience, this is, as the bishop has said, this is both a wilderness and a road. It's a wilderness, so that we're not exactly sure where the road goes, but there is a road that the Lord has prepared for us. And on that road, just like with the Ethiopian eunuch, that there are ministry opportunities that maybe we never even dreamed about before, that now that are beginning to open up to us. And so I promise you that my one operating assumption is that we'll be driven by data as much as I can, that my door will always be open for you to hear your thoughts and your concerns. And then please note that I pray for you every single day and pray for God to hold us in grace and for love to cover over a multitude of the sins that I will doubtlessly that I will commit. And then most of all, that God's will would be done in Nashville and at St. Bede's, even as it is in heaven. So those are the things that I wanted to bring up. If you have clicked on the participant section and the chat section, you'll now see that there's a link to sign up for the weekday Eucharist. There's a week to the diocesan guidelines. And also Dave Madera will join us shortly. So if you do have a question, you can ask that question. So if the participants will unmute yourselves, I guess you can either unmute yourself all together or just maybe one at a time if you're going to answer a question. I'll leave that up to you. We'll see how it works. But if you have a question, please go ahead and just click the little raise your hand button, and you should jump up to the top of my screen. Why don't I give one question from the written ones that were sent in early, just to get us started. First question is, would you please discuss the mental as well, discuss mental as well as physical health? And whomever sent that in noted that there wasn't a psychologist immediately on the panel, and it was I overlooked having somebody that could come in, and that's why I asked Andy at the last minute to come in. And Andy, are you around to maybe come in and talk about that?
Yeah, I am around. I'm here. And maybe what might be good is for me to hear from others some of the concerns that folks might have in our community from an emotional perspective. And certainly I'm hearing a range of emotional response to this pandemic. And I do get concerned about folks becoming isolated, especially those who are single and living alone and may have less opportunity for connection. And obviously all of us are facing various losses, small and large, at the same time that we're facing a lot of uncertainty about the future. And that's impacting a lot of people economically, and making it hard to plan for the future. So the mix of all of that, including the health concerns, creates opportunity for being united and caring for one another, but also for a kind of strain and stress and wear on us, and especially as this thing drags on and will continue, over the next 6 months to 9 months. So I'll just kind of say that briefly, and also just say that I and others within the group are open to hearing from folks either today or after this via email, any emotional concerns that may be out there in our community, in our body, and ways in which it'll let us know if there are needs out there, ways in which we can begin to think about how to meet them. So I'll stop there and just see if any of that resonates, and if that brings up anything for folks with what you're facing right now.
Somebody has a particular question about that. I mean, we can come back to that too, but you have a particular question about kind of the mental aspect of the emotional aspect of this as well.
Sammy and Andy, it's Shannon, and I actually have a question about this. And I was telling Jason this morning that one thing that I find challenging is I am really resistant to living in fear. And so I find when I'm at home, it's fine. But when I go out and I'm trying to be cautious and careful to protect myself, to protect other people. I find that balance more challenging because I feel like I'm having to constantly think about, is my behavior appropriate? Because like what's automatic in my body is from the last 40 years of my life, not from the last 4 weeks of my life. So I didn't know if you have any advice about how to manage being careful and cautious and caring for other people, but not, I don't know, like, I feel like if I focus too much on that, on what I'm doing with my body and how to keep myself and others safe, like then I feel like that upsets my internal balance of trying to not live out of fear.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I think that captures really well what a lot of us go through. My family right now, for instance, we're imagining seeing grandparents under a week, and we decided to self-quarantine again in a strict way for the 2-week period leading up to that. But every time we're out for any reason or picking up groceries and whatnot, we have this thought of, oh, are we somehow going to do something that makes it possible that we're going to infect our parents, grandparents that we desperately desire to see and have decided it would be safe to do so, but we want to be as cautious as we can to prepare for that. And I think that the kind of the risk benefit analysis of that is kind of different in each moment and based on the people involved, but does create a lot of angst. So I think the first thing to say about it is acknowledge it, that all of us are feeling that kind of angst around these micro and macro decisions and trying to sort out how much to move forward, how much risk we're willing to take, what's inappropriate. And I think all of that, I think it makes it really hard. So then the second thing I'd add to that is that I think we have to stay gentle with ourselves and with others. And especially around the part of the automatic behavior that we get into. Because I hear story again and again of folks who will forget and then they'll do something and then they'll feel either that shame or their full judgment from others about not having stayed, completely clean or sterile. And so it is hard to get out of those habits. And so we need to be forgiving of one another and know that we will unlikely avoid all risk and that we are going to be imperfect in it. And yet we're still trying to pay attention and be aware when we can and stay conscious of with the way we move and the things that we touch and, the risk that we're taking when we're in certain environments.
Thank you, Andy and Shannon. Thanks for the question. I appreciate that. We have Elizabeth Madera, whom I have just unmuted. Hopefully, no, I didn't. No, I muted you back.
Oh.
Okay, now you're on. There you go. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, yeah. Hey, so I have a question. Sorry, it's kind of loud here. But so I hear a lot of people, and this is still on the mental health thing, especially concerned about kids and their mental health and like the effects of them wearing masks or feeling nervous in public or about people. And I'll say personally, I think our kids have proven to be extremely resilient and they're really going with the flow. We found a new rhythm, but what would be, as a mental health professional, what do you recommend we do to help prevent that? And even in more systemic things like church or children's ministry or school, when that comes back, how do we, even though we're obviously going to have to do more protective things, what are ways to also protect mental and emotional health of kids? So come on.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I've thought a whole lot about that. There may be others in the audience that have good insight or wisdom regarding that. Certainly, with our kids, we've already begun to talk about, if and when in certain settings we'll need to wear a mask. Those who have been out of the house are the older kids usually, and they're wearing masks. Mimi was involved in making masks for our family. I think that's harder the younger the child is to kind of explain that. we've decided this week that we need to have some practice sessions with Easton, our 5-year-old, around wearing a mask. And I think that's especially hard. I imagine that there are 5-year-olds out there like mine who may not be comfortable in a mask, and it maybe limits the chance that we would show up as a family unit in some of these public gatherings. And I know that's especially complicated when we think about returning to church in the fall. I know the homeschool, the tutorial at St. B's is struggling to sort out how that may or may not work, and struggling with some of those questions. So I'm not sure. I don't think I fully answered your question there, Elizabeth. It's a good concern, and they're good questions, at least to start. Yeah.
And Heather, I think, has a response that she wants to give to that question as well. Heather, can you unmute yourself and then go?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. With children and with ourselves, it's so important that everything remains talk aboutable. And with children, to give them age appropriate rationale for what we're doing is so helpful for kids. And that spirit of accepting what is the reality and talking about it from that position, acceptance, I think, helps diminish fear. And so when we're living and moving and having our being in this world, we're accepting our limits, we're accepting our creatureliness, and we're accepting what we know right now to be the wisest way forward, and resting in that versus fearful about what's around the corner or fearing what's in the future, because we all know that worry doesn't really produce anything. And so this is kind of a immersive experience to really look at how we worry, why we worry, and to seek out voices in our lives that we can bounce ideas off each other and continue to put one foot in front of the other. Staying present as much as we can and accepting that there's a lot of unknowns, and giving children reasons why we're doing what we're doing. And what Andy said about forgiving ourselves and forgiving others, we can have that stance with our children as well.
There's a number of resources available online already, sort of with age appropriate educational and engagement tools for kids around this, and we can try and pass some of that along to Sammy if you haven't seen it already. And the only thing I would add to that is kids follow the emotional cue of their parents.
Yeah.
So self-care, put on your own oxygen mask first is probably the most important advice I would have for parents of small children.
Before we go to Gayleen, let me ask one question about masks that you just raised. There, that seems like there's a huge public conversation going on about the efficacy of masks, the need for masks. What is your, as medical personnel, especially maybe somebody like you, Heather, where you're around these at-risk people all the time, what are the benefits versus risks? And are you a mask person or not a mask person? Anybody?
Okay. Well, I happen to be a mask person. Where I work, what Morgan has done, more importantly, is following a variety of expertise in the field, the World Health Organization, the CDC, and several other places, Vanderbilt and other local hospitals. And cloth masks offer some protection. When everyone is wearing it, it offers some what you would call herd protection. Surgical is better. And of course, N95s are best. What everyone needs to know is that it is pointless to wear an N95 unless you have been fitted for an N95. and the fitting is involved. It takes quite a few minutes and quite a few different products to find which N95 fits your face best. So those who are walking around with N95s, unless they have been fitted, it's pretty much pointless. So cloth masks are what is available for the average person, and it offers some. And then where I work, we are all wearing surgicals, and that offers a little bit more. So Morgan has something.
Yeah, I would just qualify that the science around masking is evolving, just like the science around the coronavirus itself.
Yeah.
There is a long-standing tradition in East Asian cultures for mask wearing, and there's a little bit more research studies that have been done there. But at the end of the day, the layperson recommendation to wear masks is not about protecting you from getting infected. It is about protecting others from asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread. And for that, a cloth mask is sufficient. It reduces, over 90% of the particles that would be emitted if it is fitted properly over your nose and going under your chin. So that is the most significant thing. If we all take that on as an act of neighbor love, as you have articulated, Sammy, we can reduce the risk generally in the population. And I think it's going to take a while for any habit, as Shannon talked about, to be sort of established in this new normal. So it's going to be a while, and unfortunately, it's become a politicized phenomenon as well. And I just encourage you to avoid overly politicized. The more we politicize something like this, people will die because these sort of memes and messages transmit widely through the culture. So we can make a big difference by cloth masking when we cannot avoid the 6 foot social distancing in public. It doesn't mean you have to wear a cloth mask if you're walking alone, or if you're on a bike ride. But if we're in a store or somewhere like that where we're engaging others, or at church, that would be very important. So the medical masking is a different issue altogether, and probably more than we need to get into in this discussion.
Andrew, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'd actually like to emphasize something that Morgan mentioned, and that's the fit of the mask. A lot of times persons wear masks and they are not properly covering their nose and their mouth. You have different ways. Some people actually just have it above their nose or just under their nose, and it really doesn't afford you any protection if you're wearing it incorrectly. Also, we kind of get lulled into a sense of complacency when you're wearing masks, in that you may not really recognize your social distancing or observe social distancing, I'll say, norms when you feel that because you feel you have that sense of protection. So even when you're wearing masks, you still need to be vigilant and try not to get as close to other people, especially when you're in a grocery store, because if you're not wearing your mask appropriately, the person next to you is not wearing their mask appropriately, then you're not really affording anyone any protection.
Thank you. Gayleen looks like she took down her hand, so put it back up if you want to. In the meantime, Greg Voiles, I'm going to unmute you to ask a question.
Yeah, for the medical personnel, I've heard that using hosiery over the top of cloth mask helps improve them in terms of protecting others. Is that true? And what do we know about that?
You guys want to unmute yourself? Doug?
Yeah, I think it's probably pointless. Frankly, it may be true, but it may be irrelevant as well with regard to what the real purpose of wearing a cloth mask or any other mask to reduce the aerosolization of any particles, aerosol particles coming out from you and getting on surfaces that other people might pick up. Might be true, but I think unnecessary. Yeah. One of the other things about masks I might just mention, I was really mystified early in the pandemic and our response to pandemic, I was really mystified that the recommendations were not to wear a mask, because we knew from the beginning that this is primarily a respiratory virus, and that it is transmitted by aerosolized particles. And I couldn't believe that the recommendations, official ones, were, no, we don't need to wear masks. And then before long, oh yeah, we do need to wear masks. I think that was inevitable. And I think it was one of the, unfortunately, maybe not well considered parts of the early recommendations. I think it was true probably then, and it absolutely is true now, that it should be done. And we should respect one another by wearing them.
I would just
Go ahead.
add to that. Masking is one of about 4 practices that should be used together. This past week, Atul Gawande, who is a physician, author, who's written for the New Yorker extensively and a number of books that I highly encourage people to read, he spoke out for the first significant time that I noticed during the pandemic about steps to reopening. And I can even put a link into the chat here today to this article. But the main point he was making is that as we reopen, we have a lot of evidence that we've learned from hospitals and health centers like Siloam that have stayed open throughout the pandemic, and how they've done that safely. And it boils down to 4 practices of hygiene, that rigorous, frequent hand washing, distancing, screening, which isn't the same as testing. It's actually just self-reporting symptoms, whether it be temperature, fever, chills, loss of taste or smell, sore throat, myalgias, or cough. These are all things that at hospitals, we're required to report these symptoms, and that's part of the St. B's reopening plan. And then masks is the 4th. And as with HIV, we've seen effective suppression of HIV virus to an unheard of degree when we use a variety of drugs in what they call a cocktail all together. But if you take out one of the drugs, the virus develops resistance, and eventually the treatment doesn't work. I think the same thing is important to remember with masks. It's one of the 4 key strategies, along with the distancing, the hygiene, and the screening, all of which are a part of St. Bees' reopening plan. And the 5th element that he talks about in that article, which I think is really key and relevant for us as well, is culture. How hospitals have a culture of surrendering individual liberties for the collective health of the patients. And so the boundary setting that starts in the surgical theater and extends, out to dealing with immunocompromised patients, that culture of sort of sacrificing some individual liberties for the common good is built into the DNA of health centers. And I think there's a rich culture at St. Bees that's very much desiring to be a sanctuary. That's been a word before. And so I feel we've got that cultural element as well. But just remembering all those things work together in concert to protect us.
So there is a question that, because of what Morgan just said, that absolutely yes, to wear a mask is part of reopening at St. Bees, even if you are sitting 6 feet away.
Okay. Even if you're preaching.
Yeah.
So before I get to, I think this is LaDonna, before I get to her question, I was going to mix in one from the from online. This one is just for anyone, whether as these safer at home orders are lifted and we begin to venture back out in different groups, how concerned are you that there will be a spike in cases and that we'll have to go back on some sort of a lockdown again? And I know I'm not asking you to predict the future, but can you share any thoughts that you have as a medical person regarding the questions that all of us have about whether is this going to work? How will we know? And what do we do if it doesn't, and all that sort of thing?
Are you just asking for the medical people?
I was, but you can say anything you'd like there, Pam.
I have a strong belief that there's going to be a huge resurgence because of people's either lack of belief in this or a resistance to authority or political reasons. I think that we're in for a very rough road ahead.
Well,
And that
to the medical, I'm sorry.
That concerns me greatly.
So to the medical personnel, what are you concerned about those things as well?
I'll let Doug go
Pam.
first.
Yeah, I certainly am. And I think it's based on both what Pam said, that there is substantial likelihood that people will leave off or abandon one or many or all four of the four things that Morgan mentioned as being really key to reducing spread. But the other is just history around viruses. There have been so many viruses that really burdened, if not plagued, populations, and they are seasonal to a degree. And so I think the likelihood is very high that there will be a resurgence. I think if we're careful and if we really love one another, we can avoid that being horrific. And one of the things that should I think hopefully encourage us is that one of the things that was missing in this first round of this virus is adequate testing. And as testing among the things to be done to reduce spread, the things that Morgan mentioned are all individual things that an individual can do. But there's another four things that are really key to minimizing the severity of a spread, of a resurgence. And one of those is testing. And so the capability to test has increased, not as much still as we would have liked, but that enables us to know who, and then to isolate the person who is infected. That will absolutely be necessary for the long term until that person is no longer contagious. Contact tracing, you've heard a lot about that, and that means tracing all the contacts that a person who is found to be infected has been with in recent days. And the fourth then is quarantining those people. So testing to find individuals, isolate the individuals, contact tracing to identify people they've been with, and quarantining those contacts. And one of the things that we and so I think if we do those well as the four things that Morgan mentioned, we can blunt the impact of a future resurgence. And one of the things that we talked about in a preliminary call a few days ago is the potential that we have right now to use our gradual reopening at St. Bees as a way to facilitate contact tracing. I would hope that all of us would agree to have our names written down when we come, each time we come together, so that if any member of St. Bees is found to be positive, we can know very quickly whether that person was together with others in worship. And we can notify those people because they need to know that they were potentially near someone who has been found to be positive. So I think we really have an opportunity to do a public health kind of neighbor love by eagerly adding our names to lists and saying, I was there then, please let me know if anything comes of this that I need to know.
Thanks, Doug. LaDonna, you are unmuted. I think that's LaDonna.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Okay, so I have a general question about the cloth mask. I've been reading online, and as some of you know, I'm a nurse too, so I've been following the different streams of information, and I hear mixed things about how long the cloth mask work before they become saturated, and the same with like surgical masks if people are wearing those. So in general, as just the average person, how often are you recommending we wash them between use or switch them when we're out in public? Like I've heard as short as like every 3 hours. So I didn't know if there's any like general guidelines and if it's okay just with soap and water, or if there's something else that when we launder them, we need to add into the wash water. So just some general things, because like I said, I've seen a lot of mixed information on the internet about that.
Thanks, LaDonna. Somebody jump in with that.
Yeah, LaDonna.
Andrew, you work around this stuff every day. Oh, I'm sorry, Morgan, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that what we practice at Siloam, we have non-patient facing staff who are wearing cloth masks, and we just wash them every day with hot water and soap. that is adequate to kill the virus if it's there. And really, in terms of when you might replace it, I think you'll be the best judge of that. If it's moist from heavy use, you've been talking a lot, that would be a good, have a backup that you could use. And, you know, you don't have to wear it 12 hours a day unless you are constantly facing other people, which you probably shouldn't be anyhow right now. I will, if I'm in a desk and closed space by myself at my office, I take my mask off, I put it back on as I walk the corridors or go to the break room. But in general, hot soap and water, we wash them daily. If you don't use it much or at all that day, you don't need to wash it that day.
Yeah, I also follow that same guideline as well with cloth masks. Daily washing should be plenty adequate. Also, one of the other reasons we wear masks is to make sure that we're not putting our hands in our faces, because as we're touching different surfaces, you don't want to get your hand in your face and your eyes and so on. So the less that you're touching your mask, and ideally, if you can be performing some kind of hand hygiene before you're taking off and putting on your mask, that would also help to prolong the usage life of you wearing it.
Couple of things from the chat bar. One is somebody had said it's a good idea to make sure that in the restrooms that automatic paper towel and soap dispensers and things like that are working in full, and we have those are ready, so that we're trying to reduce the number of things that you have to touch in order to go anywhere on our campus. So we're definitely doing that. And then there was a question about whether and I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this. If you have had COVID-19 and you've recovered, do you still need to follow the same precautions? Like, are you a shedder, or could you possibly get it again?
You do need to follow the same precautions. And part of that is we just don't know what the antibody response means. We don't really have a good confidence that you would truly be unable to get it again relatively shortly thereafter. And so in the same spirit of neighbor love and being over conservative, you observe the same precautions and be glad if that risk is lower. I think the risk probably is lower, at least for a season. But many coronaviruses that we commonly get, you can be susceptible to again a year later. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done on this.
Yeah, I saw Doug gave a big thumbs up to that.
Absolutely. And the other more sort of social reason to continue to observe all those precautions is that a lot of people you're around may not know that you had it and recovered. And if you're not wearing a mask and you're for any reason not observing those precautions, they may think that you're flouting them, and they may be offended. So let's not offend each other.
So I have a question that I guess is basically for me. Someone had asked if we are considering any outdoor services, especially for seniors. Outdoors is so much less risky for the vulnerable population. It seems like it might be a good option. And I'd like to answer that question and then use it as a question for the medical people too. So one is we are considering that. It's a little bit more complicated than just going outside, because apparently we'll need some kind of speakers and microphones, and every time we do something like that, it just does require some setup and takedown. So, but we are considering how we might be able to do that, because we have a great space just right outside my window. That's this little outdoor area that we can worship in. So you can, I would anticipate you being able to look for some opportunities for outdoor worship, because I think you're right. The incidence of outdoor transmission are significantly, drastically lower than indoor space, where you're in a space over a long period of time and it's enclosed and those particles can circulate. So my question for the medical people is, given that, one, what do you think about, I've resisted so far starting an over 65 only service, like if, you know, there's a time when you can go to CVS, or there's a time when you can go to Publix if you're more at risk. But because I didn't want to be encouraging people to come out and put themselves at risk. But what do you think about doing something like that? Maybe a smaller number, definitely outside, just for people that are at risk. Would you recommend doing that? And I had another question that I've now forgotten what it was. So that's my question.
As things get hotter, people are going to have heat strokes. That's from somebody that's
yeah.
very hot natured.
Starting with me. No, I'm kidding. What about somebody tell me something?
And older people are more likely to be hard of hearing as well. So the speakers would be especially important for them potentially.
I think the principle of having some type of gatherings outside is a wise one. I mean, we had my elderly parents over for a socially distanced dinner Friday night on our back patio at a separate table from us. And I felt like at this point in the, pandemic, continuing to isolate them was going to contribute more to their poor well-being than not. And so I think there are variations on that St. B's could entertain. I asked Sammy this morning about whether investing in a large tent made sense, to provide some shelter and shade. Could be an investment for the future, not only for next year's version of the pandemic, if we're still in this, but for weddings or other celebrations we have. So that's one possibility. But I think the idea of seniors only gatherings, although has some appeal, seniors can still infect seniors if they haven't been observing all the other. So it's not completely risk-free. I think the measures we're taking, with small numbers, if we observe the 4 principles I discussed, intermixing seniors with others with their social distance and a mask outside, I think would be just about as safe, probably.
So there was a question about whether we would need to do, whether distancing would need to be in place. And so doing those 4 things from Gwande's article and from all the things that you guys are reading about, I think would certainly be something we would keep in place. I noticed something that I think it was Morgan that you just said, which is that we can't be completely risk-free. The bishop has been very adamant about allowing people to make their own decisions. Like I'm trying not to make decisions for people, but create the field for you to make your own wise decisions. And I said, I think in the letter that I sent out this week, we can't. There's no way that I can completely guarantee your health. So a lot of this depends on your wisdom and on how much you. Do you take your temperature the night before and immediately before you come? Do you distance while you're here? Whether you will comply with these guidelines that we've got set up, and even though we can't absolutely reduce the risk, it might be one that someone over 65 wants to take. And I'm very adamant about. I'm very cognizant of the fact that I need to not take that decision away from people. Actually, I had a question from Allison. Allison wants to know if she can come work in the bookstore.
The other thing that I would just point out is that this is an opportunity for us to be good citizens to the wider community. That's part of what we're talking about, I think. And the mayor's guidelines, I pointed out only half jokingly to Sammy when they first came out, have those of us over 65, which includes Beth and me, remaining at home except for essential times to go out through all 4 phases of this reopening plan. And there's not a phase 5. So the joke is, hey, wait a minute, looks like those of us over 65 are expected to, we'll never leave our homes again. That's it. Only essential things. But I'm just trusting that there's actually a phase 5 or that everything opens wide after phase 4. So I think if we want to argue that those of us over 65 should begin opening up sooner than those guidelines, then we just ought to recognize that we would be going against the mayor's recommendations for better, or I mean, those recommendations may not be perfect, but they're there anyway. And I think Beth and I are going to try to adhere to them, but we consider exercise, for instance, an essential activity, and get out regularly for walks and bike rides and so on. I think we may just need to ask ourselves, is each thing I'm doing really an essential activity if we're in a higher risk group such as over 65?
And just to be clear, so outside, you would still need to mask. Is that right?
If you're going to
Okay.
be within 6 feet of anyone.
Okay. But if you're more than 6 feet apart, do you have to?
I would say if you're in a gathering, yes, you should.
Okay, if you're in a gathering, yeah. Any gathering, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just nearly impossible due to just human nature to always be 6 feet apart from someone. Like, it's not a cognizant decision to, walk up to someone and be closer than 6 feet. It just naturally happens in groups. There's a self-forgetfulness that just naturally happens among humans. So to do those 4 practices just is really important, because we're all learning this new way of living.
And I think also to keep in mind that each of the recommendations has built into it false senses of certainty. So this idea that magically at 6 feet, a particle is going to stop and there's an invisible force field is a myth, right? I mean, this is an extrapolation from some studies done of children passing influenza in a classroom, and it's good to have accepted, shared agreement about a boundary or a number, but the false sense that we can be certain that that's protective is something that we need to remember, not to put too much confidence in. Even the measuring your temperature before you come to work or to worship. Well, temperatures are cyclical. They don't stay at a certain height. And to be honest, the high temperature is sort of we're learning is a later manifestation of coronavirus disease at this point. So the idea that if your temperature is normal, you're good to go is also not completely true. It's one little step that we have agreed upon that together with all the other steps can help lower risk, but not completely eliminate it. And I think our culture in many ways falls prey to this idea of idolizing health to a way that we as a church community have a real witness to say health is important, but it's not an ultimate good, right? So that's a deeper theological conversation we can keep having. And we've had some Sunday school classes about this in the past, but it may be time to break that back out.
Bring it on, man. I'd come to that class.
I'll also add something to that I think is important. It's very critical that each of us as individuals have a good understanding of ourselves, because what is considered normal isn't truly a normal. So temperature, for example, as Morgan pointed out, is really good. We typically would say if somebody has a temperature greater than 100 degrees, then you have a fever. Someone like myself, my temperature usually runs about 97.5. So if I have a temperature and I'm at 99, it may be considered normal for what we deem for society, but for myself, I actually have a fever. So it's good that every individual understands their own body and how it responds, so that if I am a little higher than I typically run, then maybe I shouldn't be associating with anyone else around us.
Thank you. So this question, there's another one that came online, and that someone is concerned that we might be jeopardizing the health of members by opening too early. And so their question was, can we ramp up our virtual presence, which we're trying to do, to continue worshiping 9:30? We'll still be doing things online, and even try and expand, by the way. We pray every day, 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, 8:30 in the morning, 9 o'clock at night. Expanding, maybe offering small groups online, Bible studies online, ways for us to connect. And then they said, if we do start back, could we worship outside, which we're exploring. The last question they have is, can we have coffee hour out in the grass to spread out? my understanding is that offering any food or drink of any kind has is discouraged. So at least at this point, I haven't seen many churches that are going back to offering coffee, because there are things that you have to touch, things that other people touch to get the coffee service ready, and it kind of bumps up a risk. So that's a no for right now.
Plus, I think you'd have to bring your megaphone if you did that, so you can shout to people 6 feet away. Great fellowship that would be.
Can I ask one question before you go?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Robert.
Okay. This is of a personal nature. I'm 70 years old, but I'm in good health. I run 4 miles a day. I try to eat pretty decent. Are my risk just as high as anybody 65 and over? Or are they less likely? Or what, does that have anything to do with it? Morgan?
Good question. Somebody weigh in on that.
Yeah, I would say, just as with any health recommendation, as Andrew was saying, individualize it. And, I know I bike with Doug. I know he's in good shape. I know he is probably in better shape than me. He's not as semi-obese as me. And, those are other factors that make you more likely to suffer complications if you do get COVID. I think it's not that you're more susceptible to get the infection. It's just that age is one among several risk factors, including existing lung disease, autoimmune disease, being on immune suppressants, heart disease, that make you and obesity is a significant risk factor for having more complications if you do get the disease. So, Robert, I would say if you are in good shape and you don't have a lot of those other existing factors, that singular thing around 65 is maybe less of a complete directive to you than one among many directives that you ought to keep in mind. So once again, these are prudential judgment calls. And these numbers, it's not that someone magically becomes more susceptible to COVID when they turn 65 compared to the day before. It's just one more data point. And it's a simplified way of getting general guidelines out to the broad population.
If you notice, thank you, Morgan. If we've gone past noon, I'm happy to go until about 12:30. If other people want to go, I want everybody to have a chance to ask questions. So if medical folks, if you can stick around, we'll keep going for now. I have a couple of questions around the Eucharist itself. One is, how do we safely change the Eucharist distribution after the largest gatherings may resume? Should this be a permanent change? And then something limited, similar to that is there maybe a plan to serve the precious blood or the consecrated wine from separate cups, given that this is not possible? It is not possible to prevent the spread of germs while sharing a chalice. The bishop has not really given us much direction on that at this point. I can tell you that once we go back to larger gatherings, I mean, certainly, as I always say, the doctrine of concomitance means that you've received if you receive in one kind. I'm hesitant to go to the little small cups because it does violate something that I believe about how there's a theology underlying our practice of sharing a chalice. However, I'm not ruling that out. I would always encourage people not to consume from the chalice if you're at all concerned about it. And then secondly, if it looks like other churches are going to a different way of administering the precious blood, then I would certainly be open to that. I've not seen a way to do this. I noticed there's somebody says we used to dip the bread into the wine. Is that not a good idea? That's actually a worse idea. You're taking your fingers and touching the wine. That's why we did away with the intinction cups in the first place. So anyway, that we will not bring back intinction cups. My goal would be to do something, if it looks like the bishop and other churches are going to something where there's a way to distribute it individually, I would be open to that. I just haven't seen how that could happen. There's another question about Children's Church, whether it will reopen in Wallace Hall, and if so, what precautions will be put in place. One actually good thing I think for us is that we are at the end. Well, we're going to go slow at building up that 9:30 Eucharist that we have on Sundays, which is typically when we would worship together in the summer. Next week is Pentecost. After that, we'd be going to one service anyway. So for that service, we used to have a children's a homily that was done for children, but we are not doing that at this point because it is, I can't imagine how it's like getting cats to walk in a parade, to try to keep children socially distanced, especially when they're away from their parents. We are not inclined to do that at this point. Hopefully by the fall, maybe we're back to larger groups of 100 or more, and then we can figure out what that, and I think something that one of the doctors said earlier, or somebody said, is that we're learning about this virus, about transmission. I would hope that we would know more at that point about how we can do events that are particularly for children. Other questions that somebody might have, and I can go back to the ones that have written as well, but Bonnie Basher, go ahead.
Well, I'm at risk for several factors. So my thought has been that I need to stay isolated because if I get this, I'll probably cost society a lot of money and may not survive it anyway. But given all that, I would love to actually see people, or at least one or two people, face to face on occasion. And I don't know how to do that. But if we could all think of ways, because I know I'm not the only one in that situation who's waiting on phase 5 to get out.
So let me, that's actually, Bonnie, that's a really good question. What about people, the church isn't just here at the building. What about meeting in homes, in smaller groups? What about our life groups, things like that? When and under what circumstances should we be getting together? How does that relate particularly to someone in Bonnie's position where she is over 65 and is concerned about that? And then how would that relate to Eucharistic visits?
I'm thinking, Bonnie, if anyone has a front porch that they can put 2 chairs at least 6 feet apart, no one goes into the house. Both of those people are wearing masks, no touching, no nothing, but just being present with each other, the risk is very low. And as Morgan alluded to his parents, eventually there's other health factors that people will deeply suffer from, not only psychiatric, but also any sort of dementias just go haywire in these kinds of situations. I know that's still psychological, but and just overall well-being. So I do think that it would be so great to call up people, do that socially distanced outside, even go for a walk 6 feet apart slowly so you can still wear masks, and just get really creative on how to do that. We have a back porch that's outside, and people walk through our backyard to walk up onto our porch, and we sit very far apart with masks on. And we have hand.
Yes. Can you hear me? I can't hear you anymore.
I think I just muted you by mistake. Sorry about that, Heather.
No problem. So that's just some ideas.
And we're going to host our life group here next week on the back porch, adults only, BYO lunch, kind of a thing, just as an experiment towards that. So I think I would love, one thing I wanted to just convey, and it's conveyed in our liturgy, is to remember the poor. And the poor is not just a financial or economic it's anyone who has resources are not enough, whether it be financial, social, emotional, spiritual. And I think remembering those in our community, first of all, who don't have somebody in their house to interact with or a meaningful job to go and still participate in on a daily basis, that's a significant portion of what we need to remember. And they have a lot to give us. So we need to continue to iterate on this and think through ways to get some of that embodied proximity with minimal risk, not no risk.
Other thoughts or questions?
I was just going to add to all that. I think personally for me, and I think for others, it actually really is important that we have at least some times where we have a face-to-face experience. And some of the ways that I've approached that in a small group, so not a big gathering of, one or two people, having them over into the front yard with some distance. I've had some times where I've carried my own camp chair to somebody else's yard so that I'm not touching anything, carry my own beverage, some water, and or have some Clorox wipes open where they can take one of those wipes and wipe down the chair that you provide for them before they sit in it. And I think that that's likely to be very safe, and also an opportunity to have some of that personal, concrete, face-to-face connection. And I do think that's critical because there is some, as familiar as we've become with Zoom, it's still a bit of a veneer. There's still a breakup in the speech. It is not the same as the seeing someone face to face. And I think that might be a way for lay Eucharistic ministers to come and perhaps be with folks in the community with that at that kind of distance for a moment. And then probably whatever the same things are that are going to be done for distributing the Eucharist in-house would need to be done, with that kind of distance as well. If it's going to be on a porch, you can leave open the door, prop it open, so that nobody has to touch handles on the door and that kind of thing. Anyway, just a few other ideas there, thoughts about that.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Galen is back, and you are unmuted.
Thanks. Hey, Andy, I have a question for you about reaching out for help. And I know that Sammy has been really great about asking me as a staff member, have you heard of anyone who needs help? How are you doing? Sending out calls for, hey, we're here for you, and the communication. But personally for me, it's been like an up and down. I'm not alone in my house, but I'm single. And so that's been interesting. I do have a great community, and it's been really hard transitioning to work from home and what I do as a teacher. So, but it's really hard to know, like when do I reach out? When do I finally say, oh, I'm having a hard time today? And the feelings of like shame or incompetency around that. So I was just wondering if you had any advice about who to reach out to, or Sammy, if there is kind of what your direction is when someone reaches out to you. Anyway.
Yes. Thanks, Galen, for that question. I was talking about the difficulty of being isolated if you're alone, but there's a whole nother experience of being trapped in your house with, everyone. And I certainly get that now being home. Yeah. And, I'm used to going out in the world. And it's funny, I've joked before that I actually go to work to rest. And I'm now at home and, doing telehealth visits online, and I'm getting kind of video bombed by my kids being loud and whatnot, and patients kind of wondering about, oh, what was that? So I think that can be really hard and really trying. And early on, that was a big adjustment for me. some of the simple things that I always do early on quickly, if I'm feeling any negative emotion or despair, I do reach out to friends pretty quick and acknowledge that, and have developed, 2 to 3, 4 people that I can call and say, hey, I'm off today. It's hard. I'm feeling especially low. And if I can do that on a day when I'm doing well, when I'm doing good, it creates the rhythms for sharing when things are harder. And maybe when I'm having a lot of negative emotion, whether it be depression, anxiety, whatever. So that would be a kind of first aid level of, being sure that you have and others have, that kind of connection where you can share, openly with folks about just what it is for you in the day with whatever emotion. And then I'll just say that I'm certainly open to hearing from folks during this time. If there's anybody out there, if there's a way in which I can be helpful to you, just as a fellow parishioner, a brother in Christ, happy for you to reach out. There are plenty of folks that are offering telehealth visits, and the therapist I see has been seeing me, on a telehealth platform, and that is helpful. And so there are professionals out there. If people need that level of help and care, then there are still ways to get that during this time. And certainly, I have here and there people will reach out to me, like Sammy might, or other priests in the past, to ask me anonymously about ideas of how to get people help, and I'll share some, options for who people might meet with. But I think as this thing draws on, I think that there is going to be a heaviness in it, and for those of us who might be sensitive or vulnerable to any kind of emotional struggle, it could weigh on us and begin to have a that kind of stress and anxiety can begin to really take its toll. So I would hope people would feel comfortable to reach out and to whomever, to Sammy, me, if you want, or just whomever in your circle of friends, to seek and ask for help.
Absolutely. I'm not doing, I don't know what we call tele spiritual health, whatever it is, God, Jesus. So we will do that too. Just call me and we'll definitely talk. We got about 5 or 6 minutes to go. And I know that David Madera is now on. Oh, wait, Bob, did you have another question?
Yeah, I wanted to make a suggestion, maybe. Maybe what we could do is have some volunteers who you would give to everybody in church their phone numbers.
Right.
And I'd be willing to volunteer that too, that there'd be specific people that if they feel comfortable calling, that these people would be available, at any time, the number or the email or whatever, so that these numbers would be available in general for anybody in the church that are having kind of
two things there, Bob. One is that we do have, so make sure that if you haven't downloaded and are using our new Breeze, the new directory, that you do log on to that, so you do have contacts for people that you need. But also, Gretchen, are you still on?
I'm here.
Okay, could you tell people about what the vestry has been doing?
Yeah, and there's trained too. Yeah, we have divided up the directory, and vestry members are calling everybody in the congregation. Some people have already been called, some will be called. And some of it is simply checking in, but it's also just asking how people are, and do you need anything practically, physically, or emotionally? Can we pray for you? That kind of thing. So we are canvassing the whole congregation and consolidating the needs and sharing those with Sammy and Butch if there is pastoral care follow-up that needs. And the vestry members are continuing to call the people who have expressed a desire to have that contact more consistently.
Thanks, Gretchen. So Bob, we are trying to do that to make sure that there are people that are specifically calling you. Doug Heinberger, I'm going to ask you to say something, but to hold on a minute, because David Madera should be around here somewhere. And I just have a general question, David. Can we still sing? What does that look like? That's basically what I'm getting from multiple people is what about music?
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one. Unfortunately, a lot of data is starting to emerge about the risks that congregational singing presents. Most specifically the fact that the projection of aerosol particles and droplets is significantly increased by the act of singing, which engages so many more muscles and so much more lung force than normal breathing, normal speaking. The data is still early, none of this, not so much of this stuff is not, long-term spread with large groups of people, but what they're suggesting is that if, the normal distance, safe distance for talking and being in someone's presence is about 6 feet, for singing, the radius increases to about over 20, like 20 to 30 feet or something like that is what some of these early projections are saying. And so a lot of choirs, performing choirs are already planning on not having 2021 performance seasons. And churches are starting to figure out what that means. So, hopefully new data will emerge that will give us a better sense of of what we're looking at there. But it's unlikely that when we begin gathering together for in-person worship, especially inside, that congregational singing will be a part of that for a while. What may need to happen is, I will probably have a cantor in the loft, much like we've been having on our live stream, someone who is at a safe space distance from everybody in the loft and with a mask and maybe even behind some other sort of screen, who's sort of singing on behalf of the congregation, and the congregation following along, participating in your minds and in your hearts, and maybe even mumbling the words behind your masks. Some of you only mumble on Sunday mornings anyway, and that's fine. You just keep doing that. So that's probably the realistic picture of what congregational singing will look like. Fortunately, we've got some very fine instrumentalists at St. B's, and so we'll be able to bring some of the heart and soul that the music ministry likes to bring to our worship that way. But that's sort of the reality. And will we have a choir anytime soon? To some of you choir members on the call, I don't know. And it's something I'm still reading about, doing as much research as I can, praying about, crying about. So there we go.
Thank you, David. And so look, it is 12:29 exactly, about to flip to 12:30. I wanted just to remind everybody about the relevant documents that are online. You can find on our website. Go back and look at that email that I sent this week. I continue to communicate as much as possible.
This one game.
Also, that if you are interested in,
it's about to wrap up.
Oh, see, there's Gretchen sharing with us. On our website, also, if you would want to sign up for one of these Eucharists, come and do that as well. So let me give you the blessing of the Lord. Go into the world in peace. Remember the poor. Be kindly affectioned one to another. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you now and always. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for being part of this panel. All the doctors, the nurse, the wardens, and everybody for being a part of that. And for Sally for helping make it happen, for David coming in at the end to tell us about music, and for each one of you being a part of this conversation, which is about how we live together and worship together. So thank you for being here. Call me if you have questions. God bless you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Good to see you all.
Yeah, bye.
Good to see everyone. Peace.
Bye-bye.